coast in federal and state waters. So thank you for taking the time today to share your perspectives with us.
Awesome. So we can go ahead and jump in. Our first speaker for today is Isabel Yard. She is a sustainability specialist for the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe. So whenever you're ready.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel Erod, she, her, and I work as a sustainability specialist at Blue Lake Rancheria. I have a bachelor's of science in biology from the University of Toledo and a master's of science in environment and sustainability from University of Michigan. I also attended part of the April committee meeting in person in Irvine, California. So it is good to see the committee members again. I'm speaking to you today at Blue Lake Rancheria. I'm normally based in Orange County, California, and I'm also joined on the call with Heidi Moore Gwinnett, who's the Tribal and Government Affairs Director at Blue Lake Rancheria, and she can help answer any questions from the committee. So I wanted to give a little brief background about Blue Lake Rancheria, or BLR. BLR is a federally recognized tribe in northwestern California near the cities of Eureka and Arcata, a few miles inland from the Pacific coast along California Highway 299. The tribe's federal trust lands span the Badawat, Baduwa''T. The Badawat is also known as the Mad River, and tribal members of Blue Lake Rancheria have been stewards of this river valley and watershed since time immemorial. The tribe's ancestral territory ranges from Little River to the north, ridges between Redwood Creek and the South Fork Trinity River to the east, Humboldt Bay and the Eel River to the south, and the west into the Pacific Ocean. And this area covers a vast and diverse landscape of redwood and mixed conifer forests, oak woodlands, prairies, alluvial flats, gravel bars, fresh and saltwater marshes, tidal flats, estuaries and dunes, rivers, creeks, and wetlands that connect them. And within this Aboriginal territory of the Wiyot people, the tribe also includes members who are Tolowa, Fupa, Coke, Yurok, Redwood Creek, and Cherokee Indians. The tribe was established in 1908 as a refuge for, quote, homeless Indians. The tribe was terminated in 1958 and then reinstated to federal recognition status in 1983. A 2023 study by Trueblood et al. Found that the California Rancheria Termination Act of 1958 set tribal governments back by over 650 years. So Rancheria, since its federal reinstatement for the tribe in 1983, BLR has built nationally recognized initiatives in climate resilience, the solar microgrid that's displayed behind me in Heidi's background as well, and in food sovereignty. And Blue Lake Rancheria's tribal leaders have worked tirelessly in rebuilding tribal government operations and engaged in regulatory processes in the past and currently. The tribe has over 100 acres of land and trust and has that thriving economic enterprises that support local jobs. They have a hotel, casino, gas station, government operations, programs, and a whole slew of government departments, including environmental protection and sustainability. And so the tribe has been engaged with the offshore wind process for a couple of years now. Tribal leaders are on the advisory board for the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, or POWC. They're also on committees for the Humboldt Bay Harbor District Heavy Lift Terminal that's proposed as one of two staging and integration sites for the offshore wind industry on the West Coast. And they have continually met with agencies such as BOEM, BSEE, Department of Energy, and then state agencies like California Energy Commission, CPUC, and CAISO. And that engagement has mostly been in like listening sessions where agencies usually have several tribal nations in the room together, and their agency staff listen to concerns from tribes. And a lot less often it's one-on-one government consultation, but we do engage in that as well. The tribe, along with other Northern California coastal tribes, were also contacted by the Army Corps of Engineers in early 2025 to have a listening session that has since been postponed, waiting further guidance from their agency. And then other agencies that we have spoken to or are tracking engagement opportunities in the future about offshore wind is EPA, NOAA, BIA, US Fish and Wildlife, and at the state level, California State Lands Commission, Coastal Commission, Ocean Protection Council, and much more. So this is just a very small piece of all of the formal engagement and regulatory processes that the tribe is trying to track. And offshore wind is not just the turbines out in the ocean. For us, it's also the transmission lines, which will make landfall within the tribe's ancestral territory and have different developers than the turbine operators and have different set of impacts, as well as port development, which is the most tangible aspect of our engagement currently. And then for more context for the committee about the coastal conditions, in Northern California, Humboldt Bay has a history of extractive industries from the gold rush, the timber rush, the cannabis rush, and this region has a crisis for missing and murdered Indigenous people, which is a concern for public safety and extent for social and health services. There's extreme drought, wildfires, sea level rise. Humboldt County has a really unique energy situation due to its remote location and susceptibility to natural disasters. So the county's connection to the main California grid is limited. The infrastructure is aging and it makes it reliant on a single power plant with vulnerable outages. So any new development, including like housing, healthcare, social services, are unable to expand with these present demands due to the supply of power in our aging grid. With that being said, the tribe is clean energy adopters and recognizes that the climate crisis is real and has very present threats to life and species, including culturally important species such as salmon. To this end, the tribe is not opposed to looking at a whole host of clean energy options. And the tribe recognizes that the coast off of Humboldt has the asset of wind, strong winds, and we are very committed to scientific research and how this particular industry can reduce harms to life and cultural resources. However, our capacity as a tribe is very limited to engage in the offshore wind process. I'll give some examples. So while some agencies offer consultation at any point during its respective regulatory timeline, low tribal capacity to keep track of everything and when and what to engage on has the tribe prioritizing the most urgent requests to consult, and it's often not proactive engagement. So additionally, re-education of agencies is real on tribal perspectives and sovereignty related to offshore wind, which creates a burden for consultation. So tribes tend to have to be the information bearers in each meeting, needing to take the time to describe the history and our place, where we are, the social and environmental issues every time, and that's time consuming. And to use a metaphor you've probably heard before, but this is a marathon, not a sprint. And there are several races, quote, like several things happening simultaneously, like I mentioned, the port, the transmission, the marine and coastal development, all with different entities, all with different staff to keep in touch with. And therefore, the best interactions with agencies is when those agencies are actively reaching out to speak and their agency staff already has a basis of training to engage with tribal nations. They also might already understand the local issues and specific tribal priorities of the area. As an example of a recent agency interaction with Heidi and the Blue Lake Rancheria team, there's been consultation processes with the California Natural Resources Agency regarding funding structure around California's Prop 4. The agency actively sought tribal perspectives regarding how to streamline processes for tribal nations to apply for and report requirements related to the climate bond. That climate bond or Prop 4 is $10 billion over 4 years to protect communities and lands from climate risks. So they actively engaged the tribe. They asked them how they should streamline grant funding and the Prop 4 money, and how tribes want to be able to report back that requirements for the funding. And agencies and partners must recognize tribal sovereignty in all aspects and their direct role in decision-making processes throughout planning, permitting, operation, and decommissioning of offshore wind operations and their associated infrastructure, like the ports, like the transmission, in order to ensure traditional knowledge and cultural resources and opportunities are offered to tribes. So again, we're just very thankful and honored to speak to this committee as it relates to this study and the study needs for offshore wind and fishery impacts to commercial, tribal, and recreational activities. The tribe is very supportive of additional studies and science collaboration that includes traditional ecological knowledge, baseline monitoring, long-term monitoring to guide this work. And we have several fisheries programs that we're trying to launch in the next few years that include specific coast salmon, lamprey research, and additional aquaculture opportunities in the bay that we're hoping to start research on collaboration on. So there's opportunities in the future, but we have so far been really engaged in the offshore wind process off the Northern California coast. And I would just want to pass it to Heidi really quick to see if she has anything else to add.
That was excellent. Thank you, Isabel. The only things that I would like to add is that it's been really important for Blue Lake Rancheria to be at the table where decisions are being made. And so as a practical example, Isabel and her colleague, Maddie Hunt, were asked by myself to engage in a research project around the feasibility of a green port heavy lift terminal here in Humble Bay after we had been told by the Harbor District that it was technically impossible. And so they engaged in a case study analysis and drafted a comprehensive white paper. That white paper then was shared with members of the Humble Harbor District, and it actually led to action. It led to an adoption of a clean green port terminal strategic plan resolution. And so again, being at the tables where decisions are made, and then more importantly, influencing those decisions. So anyhow, really proud of that work that the two of them offered. And then we now also have important seats. I'm on the Community Advisory Committee with the Heavy Lift Terminal, and then Madison Hunt serves on the Green Terminal Working Group. And so like Isabel said, tribal capacity is a very real issue. But one that we continue to lean into. Isabel also talked about the importance of science and integration of traditional ecological knowledge. We also serve on the POWC, the Pacific Offshore Wind Collaborative, with other science-based institutions. including Cal Poly SLO, Cal Poly Humboldt, and Oregon State University, and other scientific agencies. So pretty busy up here on the North Coast. The last thing that I'll add is that the economy here in Humboldt County is pretty depressed. There are not a lot of livable wage jobs. And so with the wind industry potentially coming to Humboldt Bay, there is some potential opportunity to change that outlook, especially for our young people. So we have just implemented and launched our inaugural course, one course in a series of courses that we've designed around low voltage electricians, a pre-apprenticeship program. We have 26 participants, 25 of whom identify as being tribally affiliated, and I'm super happy to report that 13 of them are female. We're trying to disrupt the traditional historic industry. So with that, thank you for giving us a moment to share some of the good work that's happening here on the North Coast.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Before we move on to the next speaker, we want to see if there are any specific questions that any of you, our committee members, might have for Isabel or Heidi. And if not, we can move on. Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands, so we can keep it moving. Our next speaker is Kevin McKernan. He is the Marine Director for the Yurok Tribe. I did see his comment that his internet connection might be a little unstable, so hopefully we can get connected with him. But Kevin, if you're stable enough, you're up.
That reason, so I apologize. And please, someone stop me to try to listen to somebody with bad internet connection. So once Kevin McKernan, Director of the Marine Program of the Yurok Tribe. The Yurok Tribe is the largest tribe in Northern California, over 6,000 members. Centered on the lower Klamath and Humboldt and Del Norte counties, including 60 miles of coastline and territory out into the ocean. How's it going so far? Doesn't sound like people can hear me.
It's pretty good. It's about 90%.
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Apologies. So tribes fishing Hoopa tribe on the North Coast. And just to cut right to the good and bad examples, actions, the first to have a co-management agreement with the Department of Interior management of the salmon fishery on the Klamath River, which has been long held up as a success. Co-equal co-management arrangement with trust responsibility to the tribe, for that being fishery. The federal government actually does have a ability and government. That's a and the states, the state, I would say the state of California used to not have a very good interaction with the tribe. Tribe in the 10 years, and as Isabel was referencing, they've become much more proactive coming to the tribes were made. And I think, I mean, it might rub this group the wrong way, but the last institution that we still have an issue with is academia. Even our local university is very tribal to science. I think as in the historic agencies with scientists, not all are, but some are. The Yurok Tribes Fisheries Department, for example, has over 200 and a whole technical services branch with a survey plane and survey vessels and lots of technical abilities, yet we're not invited to or be considered as a party to be looking into the science of the impacts of offshore wind yet. I'm hoping to change that. As far as the offshore wind process goes, I don't think Boehm and Bessie were familiar with working with tribes like some of the other federal agencies were. The Humboldt offshore wind project, I think there was too fast. The tribe was brought in pretty late in the process. The leases and granted to the companies, and when that much momentum and money's involved, that it's there's no pause or step back to impacts might be. The impact now will be studied by, so that is had turned around and was looking good in our interactions with them as we asserted need to be involved in the process. We were progressing on a co-management at one point and went dormant at the beginning of this year. But that had the promise, one of those good be, as I referenced before, interior. That's pretty much all I have. So I would say in the framed, the questions were the tribe involved in regulatory processes, and I would just say it starts for the regulatory process, or it should, with first identifying, as a problem and ultimately solve it. Pretty much presented with a problem, and the only way to solve is off, and people still continue to echo that false dilemma argument that there's an either-or decision. The tribe's very much committed to climate change and is very much impacted by climate change. So it's a serious issue, but it can't come at the expense of the cultural impacts, which are unmitigable, as well as the natural resource impacts, primarily to its fishery, which are admittedly by everyone unknown, most part. So at this point, experiment, there's a lot of assurance, not helpers, but also agencies that are very much behind this, and look at some recent examples, especially in the community of Nantucket. They're experiencing some buyer's remorse based on some of those promises made before they signed up for it. The lighting, they were lighting on those turbines would not be on unless air came near. Were involved. Although the Humboldt offshore wind area is 20, it certainly still will be visible. It will absolutely be visible, right, towering over Wiyot ancestral territory and the island of Tuluwat. But as far as the Yurok tribe is concerned, it's also visible from ancestral territory evening and in the daytime. That's when I speak to the cult, how they are unmitigable. So yeah, stop there, but I think I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. That was great. We'll open it up if anyone has any specific questions for Kevin as it relates to the Yurok tribe. Okay. Again, I'm not seeing any hands, so we can keep it moving. Our next speaker is Julie Seastream. She is a tribal council member for the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. Julie, when you're ready.
Thank you, Madeline. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Julie Seastrom, Hannes Coos, and one of 7 tribal council members for our Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. We are a federally recognized sovereign Indian nation with authority and jurisdiction over its citizens, its territories, and its resources located along the Oregon coast. Since time immemorial, the tribe and its members have resided on the Oregon coast and relied upon its abundant resources. The ocean and much of the associated shoreline areas are of traditional, religious, and cultural importance to the tribe. The tribe's religious beliefs, traditional practices, fishing first foods, and relations are interconnected and influenced by all that is encompassed in the broader ocean. Historically, the diets of our tribal members primarily consisted of salmon, shellfish, plants, and land animals. Tribal members continue to rely on the ocean and the coastal area for fishing and gathering. These activities are an important part of both our members' subsistence and culture. Tribal members engage in commercial fishing, and tribal members fish to ensure that salmon and other species are available for important ceremonies, including events like our salmon ceremony, which will occur Sunday. The tribe and its members retain the right and continue to practice their culture, religion, and traditional lifeways within their ancestral territory, including the ocean. Tribal members value and attribute significant cultural and religious significance to the ocean and its untouched ocean viewscapes. Tribal traditions include a respect and a reverence for natural law and create a powerful voice for responsible environmental stewardship. This is well illustrated by the tribe's Natural Resource and Culture Department, which is committed to the preservation, protection, enhancement, and management of the tribe's natural resources, as well as being dedicated to restoring the environment within traditional cultural and historical boundaries of the tribe, to improve the quality of life and provide direct social and economic benefit for the tribe and its people. The tribe remains an important part of the surrounding community, and it seeks to protect the abundance of traditional and cultural resources within the ocean and associated shoreline areas. In 2022, BOEM proposed private offshore wind energy development on approximately 194,995 acres offshore southern Oregon, with their closest points to the shore ranging from approximately 18 to 32 miles. When initially proposed, the Tribal Council passed a resolution supporting the offshore wind energy development, providing impacts to the tribe and the environment would be mitigated. However, the lack of meaningful consultation with the tribe, coupled with the failure of BOEM to analyze impacts and identify mitigation, forced the tribe to change its position, opposing BOEM's proposal and even resulting in litigation against BOEM, flawed NEPA and Natural Historical Preservation Act process. This opposition is reflected in resolutions passed by the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, the National Congress of American Indians, and many tribes that either called for a pause or opposed offshore wind development because of BOEM's failure to meaningfully consult and for failing to analyze and disclose the impacts. There is no doubt that little information exists about the impacts of floating offshore wind energy development on fish habitat, marine mammals, cultural resources, and the ocean ecosystem in the Pacific Ocean. No current floating offshore wind energy facilities have been constructed or operated on the Pacific coast of the United States. BOEM's proposal would place wind energy facilities in important fish habitat, marine mammal migration routes, and areas that contain viewsheds that are culturally significant to our tribe. The BOEM process failed to consider many of these concerns. BOEM received numerous comments from the tribe requesting that it considered ecological, cultural, seismic, and other impacts associated with construction and operation of the wind energy facilities, including impacts associated with cables that would extend to and through near shore and shoreline areas. The tribe also requested that the cumulative impacts of energy development along the coast, including on the California current and on the migration of marine mammals and salmon, be studied. Importantly, the tribe requested that areas that are critical fishing areas, marine species habitat, or important cultural for the tribe be excluded early from the process. BOEM failed to respond to many of these requests, stated that they would happen much later in the process in studies conducted by the developer, and, as in the case of nearshore impacts, that it was for the state not the BOEM agency, to study. BOEM also indicated that they may or may not look at accumulative impacts. There were no indications on how this decision would be made or how the impact of multiple projects along the Pacific coast would be assessed. The tribe was not alone in requesting that impacts be analyzed and sensitive areas excluded from development, particularly related to marine species. The Environmental Protection Agency recommended in scoping comments that the draft EA include a fisheries habitat impact minimization alternative to determine whether portions of the potential lease area should be avoided due to impacts to bottom habitat. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife recommended that BOEM consider an alternative that excludes areas that contain sensitive and important habitats. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration requested the development of an alternative that would exclude sensitive and irreplaceable living and non-living habitat features. The Pacific Fishery Management Council requested that areas of importance to habitats, fishing, and the broader ecosystem be excluded from the future lease areas. As a tribe with historic and cultural connections to the ocean, it is critical that impacts to fisheries, fish habitat, marine species, cultural resources, and viewsheds be understood early in the process. BOEM refused to either conduct such studies or commit to the tribe that impacts would be understood and mitigated before development occurred. BOEM's process also lacked meaningful consultation with the tribe. This was confirmed this year in the General Accounting Office's report, Offshore Wind Energy: Actions Needed to Address Gaps in Interior's Oversight of Development, which found that BOEM has not consistently engaged in meaningful consultation with tribes, that it has failed to demonstrate efforts to consider or address tribal concerns. As with any other major energy project, the tribe expects BOEM and other agencies to meaningfully consult and to assess the impacts of wind development of fish, whales, fishing opportunities for the tribe, archaeological resources, and important cultural and religious places to the tribe. There's a notification that we received yesterday that I don't know if anyone on the meeting today has received, but we received this from the U.S. Department of the Interior yesterday. The title is BOEM Rescinds Designated Wind Energy Areas on the Outer Continental Shelf. This is dated 7/30/2025, sent to us by Brian Walsh. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, today announced it is rescinding all designated wind energy areas on the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf. This action is being taken in accordance with Secretary's Order SO 3437, ending preferential treatment for unreliable, foreign-controlled energy sources in department decision-making, and the Presidential Memorandum of January 20th, 2025, temporary withdrawal of all areas on the OCS from offshore wind leasing, and review of the federal government's leasing and permitting practices for wind projects. WEAs were originally established to identify offshore locations deemed most suitable for wind energy development. By rescinding these WEAs, BOEM is ending the federal practice of designating large areas of offshore on the outer continental shelf for speculative wind development, and it is de-designating over 3.5 million acres of unleased federal waters previously targeted for offshore wind development across the Gulf of America, the Gulf of Maine, the New York Bight, California, Oregon, and the Central Atlantic. And this came from BOEM, the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. It manages the development of the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf, energy, mineral, and geological resources in an environmental and economically responsible way. So for us, this was a great and good positive action. And I don't know about how anybody else feels on the panel or not, but for myself, it was a relief. And I think that I have our lawyer with us, Rick Eichensat, is also on Zoom. If he's here, he may have a few words to add as well. I thank everybody who's here today for coming forward and sharing the commentary that you have. I heartily agree with the first speaker's comments about it being a re-education process every time you go to consultation. And also, you know, the idea that we're being asked to come to the table and that we're being asked to speak. We very much appreciate that. And when Kevin was speaking about cultural and religious practices and entities not being able to be mitigated, my heart goes out to him in those comments. So I don't know, again, I don't know if Rick Eichenstadt is on or not. Do you see him? Maybe he'd like to say a few words.
Chair Seastrom, I am on. Madeline, is it okay if I just add a couple of comments?
Yeah, by all means.
Okay, thank you again. I'm Rick Eichstead. I serve as legal counsel for the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. I just want to touch on 3 points. One, the tribe is engaged with the state of Oregon and stakeholders in the Oregon roadmap process. And we actually commend Oregon for that effort. I think it's doing what the BOEM process has lacked, bringing stakeholders together, coming up with a comprehensive need for what studies are needed, what areas should be excluded from offshore wind development. So I think, as you heard with Council Member Seastrom, as well as some of the other comments, part of the process or flaws with BOEM is the process. It does not front load the information that are needed for tribes and other stakeholders to assess, where offshore wind is appropriate and what mitigation measures are also appropriate. Another example of that is, and looking at the I guess it was draft, it was not finalized, but there was a programmatic EIS done for California. Remarkably, that programmatic EIS did not include port development that some of our previous speakers in California mentioned. It also did not include the potential development in Oregon. And as Council Member Seastrom commented, BOEM at no point assured the tribe or folks in Oregon that there would be any sort of comprehensive cumulative effects analysis, through a programmatic EIS or otherwise, to look at, what's the total impacts of offshore wind development to migratory species, including salmon. The last point I want to raise is, again, this is a process point. Throughout the process, tribes asked BOEM for technical assistance. One of the previous speakers spoke to that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And this process taxes tribes, their resources, their limited staff. Rather than provide direct technical assistance to tribes, BOEM hired its own contractors and made those available to the tribe. When CT Clusie approached them, these folks had no experience in West Coast fishing. They had no experience dealing with, tribal cultural resource issues. So it was really, frankly, an empty promise provided to the tribes, and I don't think would have added, much to the process. So, and part of that gets to, as Council Member Seastrom pointed out, the General Accounting Office's report that finds significant flaws in how BOEM, consulted with and otherwise engaged with the tribe. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both, Julie and Rick. Again, we'll open the floor if anyone has any questions for either of them as it relates to their speech. much. I'm not seeing any hands. So unfortunately, our next speaker, I don't see him on the line. Apologize, Sam, if you are. But in the case that he's not here, we can move on to our final speaker, which will be Rufus Arnold. He's a vice chairman for the Macaw tribe. So Rufus, if you're ready, the floor is yours. I thought I saw Rufus on the line. Okay. Well, in that case, we can give him a little bit more time. We are a bit ahead of schedule. So another part of our agenda included just opening up group discussion to both our liaisons and our speakers and our committee and really anyone available on the line. So Annette?
Thank you very much, and thank you for our speakers. We greatly appreciate your perspective and your input. I was wondering how you rate job creation. It had come up, and just I would appreciate hearing from each of you as to how important that opportunity would be, for example, in a type of situation where you're brought to the table in the appropriate way, that you are on board with a particular development. What are your thoughts, and how do you approach kind of that job creation aspect?
This is Kevin, if anyone can hear me through. I'd say it's a similar response I made about climate change and offshore wind being the only answer. As far as job creation goes, one possibility, but there are.
I'm not hearing anything. This is Dave Checkley. So, yeah.
This is Rick. Actually, this doesn't directly answer the question, but I know one of the comments that the Confederated Tribes raised in regards to employment, the south coast of Oregon, like many places, has a giant housing crisis, and it wasn't apparent in any way how, and it's really short-term additional jobs associated with construction. I think, as we know, operation of these facilities is, doesn't take a lot of people. But the tribe was concerned, how would, limited housing and other limited, medical and other infrastructure be accommodated by that spike in folks coming to the South Coast.
Excellent, thank you. Are there any other comments or questions for this group discussion? Oh, I'm sorry, I just got notification. Rufus should be able to join us now. I think he is on the line. So Rufus, if you're available or if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Hey, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I was on my cell phone and I was having trouble figuring out how to unmute there. The layout was different than it usually is. Anyway, I'd just like to thank the Academy for putting this together and allowing us to kind of talk about the process and our experience navigating the process. The experience at Macaw was very challenging. We are a federal treaty tribe, and we have treaty adjudicated rights to fish and resources within our marine UNA, which has been determined by many federal court cases over the years. So we have an area that's deemed legally deemed acceptable for us to fish in, and the way that we interpret that legally is that we also have rights to any migratory fish or mammals that go through our treaty area. Our UNA stands for usual and accustomed, which is a federal term. So any project that's going to affect our resources of that nature, we have a policy that tribes need to be involved at ground zero, not as the calls and the call areas are being called for. So that was part of our difficulty. We believe we should have been involved earlier in the process in the planning discussions of the call areas, not simply when they're put out to bid. And then some of the other difficulties that we faced during this process was understanding the organizational structure, where BOEM begins and or ends, and where BESI starts, how BESI figures into all this. That was all I guess it was a yarn to unravel, really. So we've met with both BOEM and BESI on how this regulatory process works. But it was difficult, and there are 5 tribal council members, and we have our attorneys and some of our fisheries scientists. So we have a very limited labor pool working on this and trying to figure out how to legally move within this process to ensure that our rights are going to be protected for our fishermen who make their lives on the water to provide for their families, to have subsistence fishing. It was difficult, challenging. Some examples of federal agencies that we believe have incorporated us in this ground zero manner that I'm speaking of. The Coast Guard is pretty good about it. NIMFS is also very good about it. Anytime NIMFS passes federal regulations or rules on things like this Inflation Reduction Act, some of the hatchery funding that they've allocated, we're always included at ground zero when they're planning the dispersal of funds, or planning for the dispersal of funds, not just the dispersal of funds. So NIMFS, Coast Guard, anytime they're conducting operations within our marine area, they always coordinate with us before they even think about doing it, so that we can plan together. Some suggestions from my council are incorporating legally. We found it challenging because the 2 acts that BOEM was using to assert their authority in the ocean are the Outer Continental Shelf Act and the Coastal Zone Management Act. So one thing that we call for is tribal recognition in these 2 acts, so that we can properly be consulted at the start of the process, not as the calls are going out to bid. So that's where Macaw's at in a nutshell. We took 4 or 5 trips over to DC to ensure that tribal voices are heard, and concerns about the upwelling, what the transmission lines will do to marine resources, what will happen to migratory fish populations that not only do we fish on, but other tribes fish on as well. Yeah, that's my experience working, or our experience, my collective tribal council experience working through this process. Did everybody hear me okay?
Loud and clear. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rufus. Does anyone have any questions that particularly relate to Rufus or the Makah tribe? If not, we can open the floor to everyone. If anyone would like to participate in this discussion, questions from the committee, questions from Jeremy?
Is it okay to ask a
Yeah.
question, Madeline?
Hi.
Oh, Jeremy first, but then Julie, that's all you
Okay.
after Jeremy.
Hi, Jeremy Firestone from the University of Delaware School of Marine Science and Policy. I really want to thank all of our speakers. This has really been one of the more interesting live or Zoom meetings sessions, work, whatever you want to call it, that I've attended during my career. So I thank you all. I was wondering if any of you have any experience with energy, or if not energy, large infrastructure development outside of this BOEM process, and what, are there things that have worked well there or not worked well there for you? So if you have that kind of experience, I would be interested in hearing.
Isabel?
Sure, I can speak towards that. Jeremy, and I saw Rick also had his hand raised. And of course, we have the solar microgrid that was commissioned by the tribal government in 2016. It's nationally recognized as one of the first behind the meter microgrids in the United States. And this was a tribal priority from the get-go. There was a lot of support from the Schatz Energy Research Center, which is from Cal Poly Humboldt, their technical assistants, the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, as well as the California Energy Commission. And California Energy Commission has since, developed a lot of funding and programs for tribal microgrids. This is not an outside developer scenario coming to a tribe to have more, developed lands for energy use. This is something that arrived from the tribe as a priority because of our aging infrastructure. And so it has always been a dialogue between the state and federal agencies, and gives proof that a lot of priorities and tribal perspectives, starting from that source in itself, provides a lot of community resources. It provides what is needed within the community, and rather than a developer coming to a place saying, this is what is needed, this is the regulatory process we have to adhere to, this is like the timelines that we have. This is just showcasing proof that tribes are able to do this work if we're able to be part of the process from the very get-go. And I just saw Kevin put in the chat, deconstruction of dams in the Klamath, the largest dam removal in the United States. That's another proof of what can be done if tribal priorities are set from the very get-go. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question, Jeremy.
If I could jump in, this is Rick Eichstead. So the same area that would be impacted by offshore wind, Coos Bay, Oregon. It seemed like months before offshore wind was proposed, a large liquefied natural gas terminal and pipeline had finally been put to rest. That was a project, that was approved by FERC It was actually appealed by a number of tribes, conservation groups, property owners, and the state of Oregon. And eventually, due to a number of factors, was withdrawn. You know, I often thought that the FERC approval process might be one of the worst processes to point to, but at least that was well defined, and studies occurred early. You know, and the coordination on the LNG facility between tribes and the state was stellar. You know, which ensured, as we move forward to FERC's approval, that, you know, there were ample impacts, you know, studies that had been completed, cultural resources. You know, certainly there was, you know, some level of debate. Was there enough? Did they dig deep enough? But, you know, the FERC process, you know, mandates that the tribes and states and others be given an opportunity to help define, you know, what is the scope of studies that will occur, you know, and certainly all of those need to be completed before there is any sort of decision by the commission. So again, you know, would have been I think one of the largest infrastructure projects in the state of Oregon. You know, and literally LNG or wind came right on the coattails of that process. So, you know, and I guess just to recap, the fact that that process created lots of room for coordination amongst the tribes and the state, I think it made it a better process.
Awesome. Rufus, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I guess in regard to Jeremy's question about have we dealt with any projects that are large in nature, such as this one. There are a couple examples that come to mind. One is the dams on the Columbia, the hydroelectric dams. Part of how we're affected by that is a portion of our not insignificant portion of our treaty troll salmon ocean treaty troll catch spawns up the Columbia. So after the dams went up, the to provide energy and water for irrigation on the east side, the amount of water and change to the river has resulted in the, I guess, almost total annihilation of the natural runs up the river. So that's left basically, well, most of the tribal treaty fisheries dependent on hatchery fish. So, you know, and I'm not anti-hatchery fish because that's what we have, but you know, when you make changes to the environment, changes there are effects. It's cause and effect, and it's about picking which action is going to cause the least or the most acceptable detriment to it. So I always like to point that out, that the dams are green in the sense that they're carbon neutral, or maybe more carbon neutral than other forms of energy, but they do have their drawbacks. Another process, which is actually kind of the opposite of what Jeremy is calling for, but the Makah tribe, we have treaty rights to harvest whales. And there was an environmental impact statement that National Marine Fisheries Service had to put out for our harvest of I think it's up to 3 whales is what they were looking at, or maybe even 1 whale a year, on what effect the loss of that 1 whale would have on the gray whale population. That environmental impact statement was 2,754 pages. And it just always stuck out to me that the environmental impact statement for our harvest of 1 whale was larger than any of the paperwork that was being put out for the effects of offshore wind on an entire ecosystem, really, or multiple ecosystems. So that's what I have to say in regards to large processes. I guess it's the opposite of the whale is the opposite example, where it's so much paperwork put out for what seems to be, you know, a small percentage of an entire population relative to, you know, the push to put infrastructure in the water that could potentially affect multiple ecosystems. So thank you.
Thank you. Keith?
Yeah, hi, Keith Michelle. I'm a committee member. Kevin McKernan's comments, they were a little broken up, but I did hear you say that the tribes were not included in scientific studies and perhaps they were dominated by academia. I'd like to ask, in general, do the tribes have expertise where they either could take on studies or be in partnership with academia? And have you thought about how you might bring that about?
Rufus?
Yes, Keith, I actually, we have the capacity, and we are limited in our staffing, but we find a way to get things like that done because they're important to us. We have partners that we can call on at UW, various universities, national labs. These are there. We have this capability we have the technical capability to analyze the data. We have a very advanced fisheries department. We have oceanographers. So we have the capacity, and we can outsource if we need to. There are people who we call on at UW regularly as well. So we can get that work done. That's one of the reasons why we're advocating to be included at Ground Zero.
Excellent. If there are no other additions to that question, I saw Dave Checkley's hand, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know how to put my yellow hand up in the app. I agree with Jeremy and others in thanking all of you who have presented. It's been very enlightening, and I do appreciate it. In the terms of our engagement or the statement of task, it asks for us to review the current decision-making processes for offshore wind and covered waters and recommendations for governmental consideration of all impacted communities, including tribal governments and fishing communities, in the decision-making process for offshore wind and covered waters. You've dwelt on this in a number of comments, but I'm wondering if you have specific recommendations for us to include in our report or consider for inclusion in our report in regards to that question. And I'll finally say that it seems to me that there are things that have been written to be done to include tribes in this process, but they seem to be ignored often. And I just like your take on this, and so that you could, I could be educated and ensured that I know what is on your mind that we should consider for inclusion in our report. Thank you. I'm not hearing anything, so.
Oh, Isabel?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to that last part of your question, David. In regards to agencies that there are several of them that have like training programs, like Department of Interior agencies has like a training program to understand, engage, and consult with tribal nations on impacts in their territories. There's also, I'm also engaged along with almost everybody else on this call from tribes on the West Coast Ocean Alliance. They have on their website the tribal engagement guidance document that was developed with tribal nations on how federal and state agencies should engage and consult with tribes on decision-making processes. And there are several other resources out there, but that one is very West Coast specific. That's a good resource for agencies to look at. And the West Coast Ocean Alliance is also developing its own training program to host for federal and state agencies that is based off of that guidance document. So, I mean, they're just one organization that's working on, some of that beginning education for federal and state officials that don't have the background in tribal engagement. But there's already resources out there for sure. Thank you.
Did Rick have something that?
Yeah, and I guess hopefully I'm answering your question the right way. One of the things the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower and Siuslaw Indians asked BOEM a number of times is, well, let me step back. I mean, as you're probably aware, this process is bifurcated, or probably more than bifurcated, trifurcated into a number of processes where there is a leasing decision, or a decision to grant a lease, and there's an environmental assessment that is, the scope of that EA was, having a lease sale and not, turning a blind eye to what happens later. So it really has no meaningful environmental assessment. And then BOEM says, well, once we issue a lease, we'll have the developer conduct a number of studies, and before there's a final decision whether or not to build, we'll conduct a more meaningful environmental review at that point. There's not a lot of trust in tribes to wait till that process. And I think that's part of the fundamental problems with this BOEM process. The CT Clusi had asked BOEM, can we reach agreement before you have the lease sale, as far as here's the suite of studies that you will require? And they wouldn't do that. CT Clusi ended up litigating over the EA on the lease sale, which spooked all the potential bidders, and the thing fell apart. And frankly, all it would have taken is BOEM to say, okay, we agree with you. This fishery study, this cultural resource study, we will require the leaseholder to do that. The other thing related to that is, early in the process, BOEM went to the Department of Defense, the Coast Guard, and NOAA and said, what areas should we exclude? They didn't come to the tribe. They didn't come to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and say, okay, what areas are important fishing areas? What areas do we know are really important fish habitat areas? Which areas are really important, cultural resource areas or cultural viewsheds? That same adjustment to the maps was not afforded to any of the other players in the process. And tribes are sovereign nations, and should be at least given the opportunity to engage in the discussion, even if it was, no, we can't do that because of X, Y, or Z, or we recognize your concern. Let's create a study to make sure, that those areas are protected, or we develop mitigation measures. So, I've spoke to industry groups about, hey, how would you do the process different? And it's, let's bring everybody together. Let's roll out the map and figure out where can we agree offshore wind can occur and where should it be excluded. and if the result is nowhere, well, then BOEM or somebody else has to make the hard decisions. But it shouldn't start with, these enormous, call areas that then put everyone who has concerns on the defensive to try to limit those boxes. It's just, I mean, I've engaged in other forest planning and even local zoning, and those processes never work, and that's why this process is so contentious and frankly, I think is just, flawed from the start.
Thank you.
Maddie, you are muted.
Oh, thanks. I was just saying if there were no more comments on Dave's question, Jeremy?
Yeah, thank you. And my question is actually very close to Dave. So we were thinking along the same lines on the recommendations. And sort of what I've heard and is during the course of this Zoom is training of BOEM. And I guess the question is, are we talking frontline people, or does the whole agency all the way up to the managers need training? There's been discussions of tribal capacity building. Rufus talked about changes to law, so having more explicit space for tribes under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act and the Coastal Zone Management Act. There's obviously been a lot of focus on consultation and engagement, and it happening earlier in the process, and that those may suggest, I guess, potential changes to either NEPA or the National Historic Preservation Act. So, I mean, the question sort of is, are things so broke that we need law changes, or can BOEM be reformed with where we're at? And I don't know if any of you have any insights to that.
I have a lot of insight to that, Jeremy. Yes, I thank you for your question. I'm going to try my best. I try to write down as much as I could to your points, but I just like to first say that, it's not just BOEM that probably needs education and retraining, department-wide, and also it's coordination among agencies, really, too. I speak to education and re-education just because of the changes in administration, changes that in the last year we've seen relationships that we have built over the last few years. Now those relationships are gone because those folks have retired. People are still willing to meet, but it's disappointing in the process for our engagement thus far that we've worked so hard on. And for BOEM in particular, though, we have heard from both their Pacific office and also from the national leadership of BOEM that they cannot provide direct tribal capacity funding. And also, just to travel to their Pacific office down in Southern California, we've had difficulties even getting reimbursed for travel from BOEM on related meetings to meet in person, which are so important for that relationship building. So they have specific, I believe, policies that are, congressionally developed and appropriated, and they are unable to provide direct support to tribes. They might need to partner with agencies like Department of Energy that have given direct support and financial contribution for capacity funding. or technical assistance, but there needs to be more coordination amongst department agencies and amongst, outside of the Department of Interior agencies such as NOAA that do have really good experience, at least engaging with tribes. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, an example of that I gave earlier of disappointing, engagement was the Army Corps, reached out to several tribes on the North Coast this past year. They're still waiting to hear back on engagement from them, but they're part of like the permitting process for the port side of the offshore wind development. And they asked like 100 attendees, attended like representatives from several tribal nations on a long email list to try and coordinate a meeting together. That's just impossible. So it's again like education on how to facilitate a good meeting with tribal nations if you want to do that, or just like planning ahead and making sure that tribes have one-on-one consultation if that is what's needed and time for that. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any other questions or comments? The floor is open for anyone on the line. Yeah, Brian. Oh,
Hey, thanks. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Just sort of kind of congeal what I think I'm hearing, and I think I know the answer, but I just want to ask this explicitly. We've had previous public comment to the effect that the Department of the Interior has a perfectly good tribal consultation process mapped, but that process was not followed in as you've already commented in several different ways. But I wanted to actually ask, sort of you more explicitly, would you agree with that statement? At least as it's written on paper, is the Department of the Interior's consultation process adequate in your view? Are there gaps even in that? I think we've heard a good amount about how specific things didn't happen constructively and how there could be better interagency coordination as well. But in terms of that process, are you aware of that sort of departmental secretarial level guidance on consultation? And do you have opinions about whether it's adequate or not? Thanks.
If I could jump in, just as far as how it occurred, let me give you a couple of examples. BOEM indicated to the Confederated Tribes early in the process that they should let them know if there are areas that should be excluded from the call areas. The tribe put together, probably 30 pages of comments that indicated here's some areas that should be excluded. At the next meeting, they indicated to the tribe, oops, we realized we didn't consider those in any way. We'll do better. The other complication, to be quite frank, and some of the people at this meeting or at here today were at this meeting. Liz Klein, the head of BOEM, told the tribes, Coalition of West Coast Tribes in Washington, D.C., I am being told to do this. So her discretion to slow down and consider tribal concerns was being handcuffed. They were under intense pressure from the White House to get, that gigawatt goal done. And we were told as much. So as far as their consultation policy, Interior has a policy that calls for, it states, it is the policy of the department to seek consensus with impacted tribes in accordance with the consensus seeking model. And we've raised that a lot, is where's the consensus? Again, in my my point earlier about, can we reach agreement on studies? Can we reach agreement on, what mitigation measures will be studied? And none of that was considered. Can we reach consensus on, are there some areas you'll agree to remove from leasing? And so I would agree that if they, again, sought consensus with impacted tribes in accordance with the consensus seeking model, that would be great, but that never occurred.
Thanks, Rick. If there are no other comments on that question, I see you, Annette. Yeah.
Thanks, Rick. My question is twofold. First off, you had mentioned that several people on this Zoom meeting were in that meeting where it was presented that there was a goal that needed to be met, and you mentioned gigawatt goal. When was that meeting? You're muted. Okay, there we
All
go.
right. 2 summers ago.
2 summers ago. Okay, so you're
June
saying
of
summer,
2024.
June of 2024. So
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yes, last summer. I'm sorry.
last summer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Last summer.
That's
Okay.
when Liz Klein was still in there in that office.
My other question is something that has come up in our discussions is the opportunity to see pilot projects, demonstration projects. Does that play into your perspective on potential benefits versus the impacts, the negative impacts? What is your perspective on that?
So that actually has come up extensively in the ongoing Oregon roadmap process. I think, and there are a lot of coastal interests that would be interested in seeing that. We are hearing back from industry that there's just no appetite in them funding a pilot. And it's unclear then who would fund a pilot scale project. But I think to be candid, to some extent, some of the discussions we've had in the Oregon roadmap is, maybe Oregon should slow down and see what happens with development in California. Let them be the pilot. Sorry, folks from California. I don't mean to throw you under the bus, but you guys are farther along. So, but yeah, I think that's part of the issue is there's not a lot of examples to look, at the large scale floating offshore wind in migration corridors along the Pacific. How does that impact salmon and, and other species? And I think you've heard, from the Macaw council member and others, West Coast salmon species are in trouble, between dams and forest practices and, a myriad of issues. So yeah, offshore wind may not be a giant impact, but salmon are suffering death of 1,000 cuts. So it may not take very much to throw things, into even more trouble.
Thank you.
I just really wanted to come on really quick for Annette. We have never heard of anybody trying to do a pilot project off the coast of at least Northern California. I think San Ynez Band of Chumash Indians down the Central Coast has a smaller offshore wind project off their coast. Don't want to speak on behalf of them, but I have not heard of any appetite for a pilot project from like the developers, for instance. They're invested in this, region, and they're going to be conducting surveys, but, we've asked them to describe how big the turbines could be, how many turbines there might be, and, they give a relative answer of, well, if they're bigger turbines, there'll be less turbines. If they're smaller turbines, there'll be more. And, that's not really a good understanding of our system and our marine life, how that might be affected. So maybe a pilot project would be necessary out here on this coast. I just don't think, like Rick said, that it's going to come from federal or state funding. For instance, there has to be an appetite from industry too, and the supply chain that is needed as well. So thanks.
Thank you. And so from your perspective, as we think about recommendations for our study, would a planned pilot demonstration with a planned decommissioning, would that be something that you would find as an important part of the overall regulation process, the overall permitting process?
Yeah, I'd probably have to think more on that, Annette, what it means for the tribal perspective and what that would mean for, realistically, for those that use the resources out there. Because it is like a pilot project will still impact, certain cultural resources. And I don't want to speak too much on behalf of, those considerations that I've never really thought about before. So, but that's a good flag. And I hope to continue that kind of dialogue if you just raise that up in the study.
For CT Clusi, that is something that has, at least in Oregon, that they raised a number of times is, why do we have to start with the whole enchilada? Can we do something smaller and assess what the impacts are? And I do believe, and Julie or others, correct me if I'm wrong, there are some smaller scale wave energy projects being piloted, along the Oregon coast. So that's something that's would not be unfamiliar to the Oregon coast. But to, the point that was just raised, obviously we need to make sure it's in the right place so it's not going to, cause cultural resource or other impact.
Great. Dave, did I see your hand?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to return to the terms of the statement of task once again, and at the end, in addition to what I talked about with decision-making processes, it was asked whether there are recommendations for ensuring appropriate governmental consideration of potential benefits of offshore wind in covered waters and risk reduction and mitigation for impacts for safety at sea, for search and rescue, and relevant to operations for commercial fishing activities. And so my question is, what the tribes, if you're able to say this now, perceive as potential benefits from offshore wind. And I've heard jobs and commerce, niche energy, in other words, localized energy provision might be another one, but can any of you speak to what positives might come from offshore renewable energy that you foresee right now? Please.
I think you summed it up, Dave, but I will say this is tribal nation by tribal nation considerations for sure, because Blue Lake Rancheria is not opposed with the considerations in mind for what I like explained earlier on cultural resources, missing murder Indigenous people, policies for the green port, all of these research that needs to be done to understand baseline. But there are certainly positives if we can get this done right. And at the very core that Blue Lake Rancheria believes in clean energy, in reducing the fossil fuels of our grid and promoting more renewable energy resources that are distributed around the coast and the state. And it's not just offshore wind, it's a whole slew of other things like the solar microgrid that we have on our lands. But potential benefits again would be what you just stated for sure. And I've also heard that, you know, there's certainly concern for lowering our energy use just in general. That would be a huge benefit for, I think, just our climate and fossil fuel use and air quality for everyone. And the main concern too for that is our local communities that live right up against the port in those industries that have really bad air quality. I'm thinking of the Port of Long Beach. You know, they already have such bad air quality, and they're trying their best at that port to reduce that. And so there are benefits like in those environmental benefits that we do care about for sure. And you know, we still worry that the wind turbines and that industry might also perpetuate a lot of the fossil fuel concerns in terms of like air and water quality. You know, where does the turbine become manufactured? How will it be affected those communities? Where those resources are, you know, collected from, and you know, how are they built with like green technology? So that's why we care about at this port the green port initiatives strategies. So, you know, there's opportunities for benefits for sure. And we just really, at its core, care about the fossil fuel and climate crisis for human life and our cultural resources.
Thank you, Isabel. And I'm glad you brought up the clean energy argument, which I didn't mention. It's basis for much of all of what we do or talking about. Another one is stability of the grid too. In other words, it's conceivable there to be a more stable source of energy for communities locally. So, you mentioned a number of valuable things. Thank you very much.
And David, I'd also like to chime in there on that. I my own personal opinion on the grid. So we're in an interesting place as a society because the energy consumption is not going to go down anytime soon, as much as I think it would be beneficial in some respects. We're already on the treadmill, especially with the advent of AI, quantum computing, all these new innovative technologies are requiring more and more energy to operate. And once Pandora's box is opened, I personally have a hard time seeing any of those technologies going back in the box. So where I go with it is you see all these data centers and things requiring massive amounts of energy. The math doesn't really math when you look at solar panels, the amount of energy needed to produce solar panels. Like if you're, depending on where you're at, if you're just subsidizing your grid with quote unquote renewable energies, you're going to have a hard time making the technological advancements that will eventually get us to something like nuclear fusion, where you're obtaining more energy generation from a reaction than you're putting into it. So until we get there, because I look at energy like a function, like a mathematical function where you need to exert so much energy before you hit certain breakthroughs. And at some point, at least the hope, because of this treadmill that we're on with energy and with society, is that eventually we'll get there with these new technologies like quantum computing and AI. But until then, I believe the only And solar works for some areas that get a lot of sun, solar, wind. It's very area dependent though. I believe that the only thing that's going to help us subsidize our grid is going to be some form of nuclear power myself. It's very carbon neutral. The entire country of France gets 87% of its energy from nuclear reactors. 80% are strictly on a reactor, 7% are on recycled fuel. And France they have a capacity of about 50 gigawatts of nuke power, and they only put out, I want to say, it's a very small amount of carbon emissions. There's an app called Energy Maps that I use that charts all this out. For less than a gigawatt of coal power or natural gas that France burns, they exert more CO2 than their entire nuclear infrastructure does. And they get less than a gigawatt of electricity from natural gas and oil, and they get 50 gigawatts from nuke power, and the gigawatt of natural gas still gets about the same, puts off about the same CO2 per I think it's on an annual basis. I think it's forget how many kilotons, but anyway, sorry.
Sorry, Rufus, I didn't want to cut in too much, but just kind of trying to get back to this committee's task where we're specifically charged with looking at offshore renewable energy sources.
Certainly. I just like to give this pitch wherever I go.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rufus. Yeah.
So yeah, again, just as the floor is open, if there are any other questions or if there's anything else that anybody would like to add, please feel free. Okay, it seems like there might not be much more to add. So yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Caroline.
Actually, I guess I just want to say thank you to all of our tribal members and representatives that came to speak and joined us just to listen as well, and are participating in our as tribal liaisons for this study. It's greatly appreciated, and I will turn it over to Keith to say some closing remarks.
Yeah, I just want to follow suit with Caroline and the other committee members. This has been an outstanding set of presentations. You were so well informed and so well prepared, and it's going to be so useful to us in our report development and deliberations. So thank you again for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And with that, I think we conclude our meeting.
Thank you. Thanks for the listening.
Thanks,
and
everybody.
Thanks for those tribes that were staying on the line too, that weren't able to speak as much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.